NATO expansion and the collapse of the pan-European order. Introduction. The decision to pursue a world order based on the collective hegemony of the West after the Cold War had a profound impact on the European security architecture. There was an understanding that NATO expansion would cancel the agreements for an inclusive pan-European security architecture, that Europe would be redivided, that Russia would be alienated, and that conflicts would be revived. A remarkably large number of political leaders recognized this agenda and warned against reigniting the Cold War by expanding NATO. The decision was nonetheless made to expand NATO, as Russia was weak and conflicts could be managed under the collective hegemony of the West. An expanded NATO would become an insurance policy against future conflicts with Russia, which would predictably be caused by NATO expansion. This contradiction that set the West on a collision course with Russia was to underpin the New World Order. This chapter explores the agreements to develop an inclusive pan-European security architecture with Russia according to the Westphalian principles of sovereignty, equality, indivisible security, and a Europe without dividing lines. It addresses how, concurrently, NATO expansion was pursued that rejected the Westphalian balance of power, pursued sovereign inequality, enhanced its security at the expense of Russian security, and redivided the continent with a permanent peacetime military alliance. NATO became an instrument to cement U.S. hegemony in Europe and perpetuate Russian weakness via a new strategy of containment that included undermining Russia's nuclear retaliatory capabilities. Russia, seeing these developments as an existential threat, sought to discourage Western unilateralism and promoted multilateral alternatives in accordance with Westphalian principles. A common European home versus Europe whole and free. After the division of Europe following the Second World War, the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc sought to strengthen the common world order without undermining their respective regional orders. The main breakthrough came with the Helsinki Accords in 1975, which outlined a common framework for European security. The agreement bolstered key Westphalian principles of order, such as sovereign equality, indivisible security, refraining from the threat or use of force, non-intervention in internal affairs, and territorial integrity. Yet the agreement also included principles of justice, such as equal rights and self-determination of peoples, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Principles of human security to elevate justice were thus included in the agreement of state-centric principles of order. The subsequent enhancement of trust inspired Gorbachev to initiate extensive domestic reforms and to launch his proposal to develop a common European home, which envisioned demilitarizing foreign affairs by dismantling both the Warsaw Pact and NATO. The confrontational military blocs would be replaced by an overarching common European institution to harmonize and unite the capitalist and communist blocs. The U.S. countered Gorbachev's common European home with the concept of a Europe whole and free in 1989. The U.S. was similarly dismissive of Mitterrand's European Confederation project, as it was feared that Europe would unify outside U.S.-centric institutions. The U.S. proposal for a Europe whole and free insisted on the universalism of liberal democracy as the foundation for a common Europe. Translated into power politics, the U.S. sought to expand the transatlantic system to the entirety of Europe under the leadership of the U.S. as the defender of capitalism and liberal democracy. While Gorbachev desired a common Europe, house with many rooms housing the different ideologies, the U.S. insisted on one room. Nonetheless, the efforts to end the zero-sum division of Europe eventually resulted in Moscow allowing the falling of the Berlin Wall, and then, at the Malta Summit in 1989, the U.S. and the Soviet Union declared the end of the Cold War. An inclusive pan-European security architecture was seemingly moving forward. The Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990, based on the Helsinki Accords, outlined a new post-Cold War security architecture. The Charter upheld key principles such as sovereign equality and indivisible security in a Europe with no dividing lines. The Charter also expanded the concept of security beyond traditional military concerns to include broader aspects of human rights, democracy, economic cooperation, and environmental sustainability. Strategic ambiguity appeared to conceal conflicts between state-centric order and human-centric justice. Case in point, the Charter proclaimed, "With the ending of the division of Europe, we will strive for a new quality in our security relations while fully respecting each other's freedom of choice in that respect." Security is indivisible, and the security of every participating state is inseparably linked to that of all the others. On the topic of expanding NATO, which, unlike the Warsaw Pact, had not been disbanded, it could be, and was argued that every state has the freedom to make its own choice to join it. That said, undeniably, expansion would redivide the continent and undermine the principle of indivisible security. However, there was no rule to suggest that NATO would be free to offer membership to any state. To preserve the principles of the Charter of Paris for a new Europe, NATO would have to remain a status quo power and not pursue expansionism. The project for an inclusive pan-European security architecture advanced further in 1994 with the establishment of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. The OSCE translated the principles of the Helsinki Accords and the Charter of Paris for a new Europe into an actual security organization. The founding document of the OSCE was similarly based on the key principles of sovereign equality, indivisible security, and a Europe without dividing lines. Yet, the OSCE remained largely impotent as the U.S. feared it would challenge its hegemonic rule. Part 1. As Charles de Gaulle famously argued, NATO was an instrument for U.S. primacy from across the Atlantic. The U.S. desire for hegemony in Europe did not dissipate after the Cold War. Instead, it was amplified. Former U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski advocated greater aspirations for NATO expansion as Europe is America's essential geopolitical bridgehead in Eurasia. NATO entrenched American political influence and military power on the Eurasian mainland. Parallel to the agreements of a pan-European security architecture, the U.S. began to pursue NATO expansion under the slogan of Europe whole and free. Incrementalism or salami tactics is an attractive strategy for an expansionist power. As the name suggests, salami tactics involve cutting off thin slices gradually. Expansionism creates a reaction from the country that has its security diminished as a consequence, and even allies become apprehensive. But no one action is so outrageous that it justifies a major response, while over time the full expansionist objective is achieved. The U.S. used such tactics to mitigate Russian opposition and to alleviate concerns among European allies. These salami tactics enabled Washington to dismiss and ridicule complaints and to depict any responses from Russia as disproportionate or even as unprovoked aggression. Redividing Europe to advance U.S. hegemony. NATO expansion entailed redividing European, incrementally reviving the Cold War. In January 1994, President Clinton recognized that NATO expansion could redivide the continent. So Clinton advocated developing the inclusive partnership for peace, instead of expanding NATO, as the U.S. could not afford to draw a new line between East and West that could create a self-fulfilling prophecy of future confrontation. 3. Nonetheless, the Partnership for Peace did not become an one Emmy Surratt in Victory Magnanimity U.S. Foreign 1989 to 1991 and the Legacy of Prefabricated Multilateralism, International Politics, Vol. 48, No. 4 Fev. 2011. 2. Brzezinski, A Geostrategy for Eurasia, Foreign Affairs, Vol. 76, No. 5, 1997, p. 53. 3b. Clinton, Remarks to Multinational Audience of Future Leaders of Europe, U.S. Dip 10, Alternative to NATO Expansion, but rather a stepping stone to NATO expansion by facilitating the reconfiguration of their armed forces in line with NATO standards. Washington deception was deliberate, as evidenced by the Clinton administration saying one thing to the Russians and something completely different behind closed doors. U.S. Ambassador Chas Freeman, a veteran diplomat who was involved in constructing a NATO-centric Europe after the Cold War, argues Clinton was talking out of both sides of his mouth. He was telling the Russians that we were in no rush to add members to NATO and that our preferred path was the Partnership for Peace. The same time he was hinting to the ethnic diasporas of Russophobic countries in Eastern Europe we were going to get these countries into NATO as fast as possible. At the end of 1994, Yeltsin wrote a letter of concern to Clinton about NATO expansion. Adoption of an expedited timetable plans to start negotiations with the candidates already in the middle of the next year will be interpreted, and not only in Russia, as the beginning of a new split of Europe. Thomas Pickering, the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, cautioned in 1993 that the one constant in what we have heard from all Russian interlocutors has been extreme sensitivity about the role of NATO. Across the Clinton administration, there was a recognition that NATO expansion would alienate Russia, yet many believed the post-Cold War peace could be sustained as Russia was weak and could not do anything about its grievances. William Perry, the U.S. Defense Secretary between 1994 and 1997, argued that in the early years after the Cold War, I have to say that the United States deserves much of the blame for the deteriorating relations with Russia. According to Perry, expanding NATO was a provocation that predictably undermined the peace with Russia. Perry also argued that Russia was beginning to get used to the idea that NATO could be a friend rather than an enemy, but they were very uncomfortable about having NATO right up on their border. Perry added that the proponents of NATO expansion also recognized that NATO expansion would alienate Moscow, although, as Vice President Al Gore argued, we could manage the problems this would create with Russia. Perry describes Washington's derisive attitude towards a weakened Russia. It wasn't that we listened to their argument and said he don't agree with that argument. Basically, the people I was arguing with when I tried to put the Russian point, the response that I got was really, who cares what they think? They're a third-rate power. And of course, that point of view got across to the Russians as well. That was when we started sliding down that path. Advocates of NATO expansionism recognized it was provocative and perceived as a threat, yet the assumption was that Russia would eventually have to get used to the new realities.